what other historical figures have you portrayed?
Well, Dunmore is one. One that I do frequently is a field drummer, George Thomason. George Thomason actually served with the Virginia 3rd Regiment, and he joined when he was 13 years old. 13, showed up at the recruiter's office, said, well, you're a little too small to carry a firearm, so we'll make you a field drummer. And George Thomason served 2 years as a field drummer during the American Revolution. He saw lots of action, giving the duty calls. He was always stationed by the commanders. It really wasn't considered fair to shoot the musicians because generally they were unarmed kids, and that's not a cool thing. And also, it wasn't playing by the rules to shoot the communication system. So George had grown up watching battles from the time he was a kid, and by 15, he responded to the call to arms to follow Colonel Benjamin Cleveland down to Kings Mountain to defeat Patrick Ferguson. There he served as a regular militiaman. In fact, the Overmountain Militia they're referred to, Robert Burns, in his Ballad of the American War, tells the story. Actually, he shames the British generals that lost so miserably. Robert Burns was really an advocate of freedom, of individual liberty. He had written an ode to George Washington for his birthday, really painted George Washington as this giant of a man. In fact, Burns at one point had to answer for his political beliefs because he was viewed as a traitor. And so he joined his local militia just to prove that he could keep a job with the tax department. But in Burns's Ballad of the American War, he cites General Cornwallis and really kind of makes scathing remarks about Cornwallis. And his reply is that the buckskins, they did claw, man. And the buckskins he's referring to is the militia that gathered here in Abingdon, Virginia, and marched to Kings Mountain in South Carolina to defeat Patrick Ferguson and the Loyalists gathered there. So George Thomason is one of the stories that I tell, the life of a field musician. Of course, Lord Dunmore, I tell his story. He actually had given land grants to settle this area, and the area was known as Fincastle County, named after his homeland at Blair Castle in Atholl, Scotland. From the backyard of Blair Castle, you could look down a whole line of castles, and that was the Glen of Fincastle, because you could see all the fine castles that had been built by the Cumming family when they ruled Scotland prior to Robert the Bruce and William Wallace. One of the characters that I play is a descendant of those Cummings that built the castles that Lord Dunmore's family had occupied. Charles Cummings was a young pastor who was born in Scotland, he was born in Ireland. Some people called him an Irishman, but his family was definitely Scottish, and they had come from Scotland as settlers in Ulster. And I often say, just because you're born in Ireland doesn't make you Irish, just like if you eat at McDonald's doesn't make you a hamburger. Charles Cummings was a proud Scot. He was a proud Presbyterian Scot, Covenanter, who the Covenanters actually had their own armies. And Charles Cummings was known as the Fighting Parson. Came to Virginia in 1760, began his first ministry in central Virginia, and answered a call to Abingdon, Black's Fort or Wolf Hills, whatever you want to call it. It wasn't Abington until 1790. Charles Cummings pastored these pioneer, ruffian, Scots-Irish fighting crazies out here on the wilderness. And he was known for his Indian fighting too. He actually marched alongside Lord Dunmore in Dunmore's war against the Indians into Ohio. So Charles Cummings, this pastor who built several of the churches in the area, is another one that I portray. In studying the characters, you learn so much about history that you never would have learned. The Scots Presbyterians, didn't sing regular songs. They sang from the Psalms out of the Bible. But they didn't just sing the King James Version. They had translated the Psalms into metrical form, more of a poem, and would sing them. Well, one of the first books published and bound in the colonies was the Presbyterian Metrical Psalter, and it's considered one of the main instruments for giving birth to the ideas of self-government and liberty. We don't normally think of pastors as carrying rifles or muskets into church with them, but Charles Cummings was one who did. Rufus Soul, the tavern owner, is another one that I portray. My own ancestors, I do have a Wallace in my background, but the most colorful are the French Canadians. You could identify with the Canadians, eh, Kaylee? Although your family's quite removed from Canada at this part.
Yeah, a bit
When I would go up to Canada to compete in the international competitions, we would go to the French Quarter of Quebec, and the Quebecois were not very friendly toward the English speakers. And I thought, you know, they don't seem like nice people. Then I discovered that I am one. My French-Canadian ancestors settled St. Louis, Missouri, and founded a little town called Cahokia, Illinois. And I actually found the document where they signed when they took the oath of allegiance to become Americans on July 20th, 1778. I know the day, the place, and the time that my Canadian ancestors, my French ancestors, became Americans. Now, in that, they were fur trappers and fur hunters, long hunters, if you will. So one of the characters I portray, telling the story of the beautiful land and nature that we have around here, is that of the long hunter, Michel Chartrand, who came all the way from the Cahokia down the Mississippi to tell their story and to trade with the English and the Scottish, to trade their furs. The French were very integral in building the wealth of America. So let's see. George Thomason, Charles Cummings, Lord Dunmore, Michel Chartrand, George Soule. I have 5 that I do. And sometimes I will actually portray another soldier, Low Brown, who marched alongside Dunmore in Dunmore's War. And he marched alongside my French ancestors in the Illinois Regiment during the Revolution. It's just fascinating, the treasures that you find in doing the research.
Yeah, it sounds like that's a lot of history to remember.
Yeah.
But they're so tied into each other, it's easier to remember. And some of it, it's family. And by seeing your family name there, I actually had a multiple great-grandfather who was a militia commander for the French militia during the Revolutionary War, fighting on the side of the Patriots. And it's kind of neat to see where he's buried 250 years ago, fighting for our freedom.
Yeah,
Kind of cool.
that's cool. So, who is your favorite person to portray and why?
I would have to say it's a tie between Lord Dunmore and Charles Cummings. With Lord Dunmore, I can tell a lot of history, and people seem fascinated with the Scottish accent. He was quite bombastic. He liked to party. He and his wife, Charlotte, well, Charlotte was well loved by the Virginians, and they brought children to the governor's mansion. That was something new. Lord Botetourt was a single guy who also loved to party. But Dunmore, well, he enjoyed hosting parties in the governor's mansion. And as one author put it, was as well liked as any Scotsman could be. But they loved Charlotte. And the intrigue of how he went from being a traitor to a governor serving under the crown, and all of the history in between, it's just incredibly fascinating. To complete his outfit, I've contacted a historic woolen mill in New York, and they're reweaving the specific tartan that's in his coat and waistcoat. It hasn't been woven in over 200 years. The family tartan has changed a little bit, but the exact tartan in his outfit has not been woven for over 250 years. So I'm looking forward to getting that tartan. Pastor Cummings, again, very colorful. I am an ordained minister, and so it gives me an opportunity to kind of cut loose. I serve as chaplain for a number of organizations, including the living history organizations around here. And it's an honor and meaningful to be able to read the Psalms or the Lord's Prayer in a Scottish dialect in the metrical form. It's just, for me, it's an incredible honor and a moving experience every time I do it. So the two of them, Dunmore and Cummings, seem to be my favorite.
Nice.
So we talked a lot about what you learned and everything, but what is one thing that you learned through your historical research and performance that you think people would be surprised to know?
Well, the big surprise for me was the wearing of the kilt and the wearing of the tartan throughout the acts of prescription. That was like, what? The other thing that has been kind of fascinating and relevant for today, not necessarily controversial, but history is what history is. Across the street from Soul's Tavern, the finest establishment in Southwest Virginia, was another tavern, and it was run by an emancipated slave named Fincastle Sterrett. Fincastle Sterrett had grown up in Virginia as the right-hand man for William King, one of the first millionaires in America. William King, who was an Irish immigrant, came to Fincastle, established himself. He himself served. King served as an indentured servant. He was a slave to get his education and came back. And as he began his business ventures, Fincastle became his right-hand man. Described as a mulatto with a big bushy mustache. And he would travel from Baltimore to New Orleans to conduct William King's business affairs, to negotiate his contracts, to make his business deals, to make arrangements for shipping of goods. Finn was well loved and well liked in the community, and quite a learned, knowledgeable man. When William King passed away, he had made arrangements for his emancipation through his estate. Within the first few months, within the first year, that Fincastle was a free person of color in Abingdon, he bought up over 500 acres at tax sales, buying an acre and a half for 73 cents. He just made a killing and was quite wealthy and quite loved. One of the things that drew his clients into his tavern was his fiddle music, playing the jigs and reels that were played by the Highlanders and the Scots that he had learned growing up in Appalachia. The involvement of music crossed cultures. Here in Abingdon, we have this incredibly rich cultural experience that created a new culture, the Appalachian culture, where dance, you can look at my French side of the family, as they married into the Métis Indians. The Métis Indians have jigging, which they dance to fiddle jigs. They even do a sash dance that is exactly the Highland sword dance. It was done by the Highlanders when they came to America and settled in Appalachia. Here we have flatfoot dancing. Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone, particularly Davy Crockett, often frequented Soul's Tavern, and he was known for his flatfoot dancing and fiddle playing. Just an incredible area that is so rich that our culture has been produced by everyone who came here. It's not this hyphen culture or that hyphen culture. It's America. The blending bowl, the mixing pot that blends and changes and merges cultures to create something new and exciting. And that's incredible. That's probably the biggest surprise. If you get too overburdened by today's news, you like to hear good news. Good news of how people got along, how people prospered and did well, regardless of their cultural background.
Yeah, and sharing and, being open to other ways of life too. And not just saying, well, that's not the way my culture does it, so I'm not gonna go to your dance.
In this area, you can even distinguish what town somebody's from by their style of flatfoot dancing.
That's fun.
Some little cultural things are that unique to an area.
So let's talk about the uniform again, the costume, and we talked a little bit about this in our previous episodes that Adela and I did, where we learned about sort of the original Highland dress, or the way it used to be in the 1700s, and where pipe bands are now, what we wear now, which has evolved a lot. And what is one part, because I know you've done obviously a lot of this research too, and you've worn all of these things, so you can attest to this truly. What is one part of the style from back then of Highland dress that you would like to see brought back as part of our modern pipe band uniforms?
One in particular, and you ladies might like this or say no.
Is it a gun? I see a gun in the background. Oh.
The drummer's apron.
It's a leopard skin.
This is a leopard skin one. I also have a tiger skin one. And this was a product of the Victorian era, the colonial era, which it may not be politically correct. Even the British regiments today use a synthetic. This is faux leopard skin. But during the Crimean War and during the colonial period, pipe bands actually didn't exist during the Revolutionary War and prior. The pipe was a war pipe, but it was one person. And ultimately, it got blended into the drum corps, so it really should be drums and pipes.
I agree.
Yes.
And Queen Victoria fell in love with everything Highland. When the Acts prescription was lifted in 1780, Robert Burns, glorifying the Highlander and telling his story, birthing the Romantic period, just lit a fire and a passion so that by the early 1800s, they were having fancy dressed Highland balls. And I've got some of the fiddle music. Neil Gow was a famous fiddler, a contemporary of Robert Burns, who played the fiddle and wrote subscriptions for music. They also added the dance music to it. And that popularized Scottish music and Scottish dress. Now, it was fancified in that the sporran had to get longer and the hats had to get bigger and you had to have more buttons and more lace and all this kind of stuff. And the dirks got jewels in the handles. And all things Highland became incredibly, incredibly popular. And Queen Victoria so loved everything Highland that she commissioned the War Department to ensure that there were always funds available for every regiment to have a bagpipe band. And they laid out how many pipers, how many drummers, how many tenor drummers and bass drummers and everything. And every regiment, wherever they were, had to have a pipe band. Well, during the campaigns in India and Pakistan and all of those hot, arid countries, while they weren't fighting, the officers would be hunting wild game. They'd go out on safaris in Africa and elsewhere, and lots of stories of gallantry. The Charge of the Light Brigade is one of those incredible stories of gallantry. And the officers, during their downtime of hunting, would shoot the wild game, and then they would have the hide backed with a drummer's apron, and it would be awarded to the regiment with a brass plaque. Many of them actually had the head still mounted. I think Jim Grant has one with a head still mounted on it. They would have a brass plaque stating that this drummer's apron was awarded to the pipes and drums of the blah, 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 whatever regiment on such and such a time for their gallantry and such. So the drummer's apron was used to protect the uniform from the drums, but also protect the drum from all of these buttons and hardware. And it was a symbol of the regiment's victories. The first photograph that we have of a regiment wearing a leopard tartan is actually a Gurkha bagpipe band. The Nepalese soldiers, short little guys that wear a little pillbox hat, and big fur drummers' aprons because of their gallantry. It's just one of those things that if we're going to march in formation and we're going to tell some stories, I'd like to see something like that that expresses the victory and all the hard work that goes into what you do.
That's cool.
They can be hot and miserable, but they are cool in a parade. The other thing that I'd like to see re-implemented in bagpipe bands, one of the roles of the drum sergeant major was to maintain discipline and order. These stripes were earned. And part of the duties of the drum sergeant major was to not only ensure that you had enough field musicians, but to implement discipline among the ranks. That lashings and properly instructing young soldiers how to administer discipline was the role of the drum sergeant major. So now that I'm drum sergeant major again, I'd like to see a certain amount of discipline reintroduced, especially to the tenor drummers.
I'm glad that's not a thing now, because Dave would have had a field day with it.
Really? I trained him well.
Yeah, I don't know about that one. People who can't see, he's got a nice whip there.
Cat of nine tails.
Yeah, cat of nine tails. No, thank you.
Pass.
Just kidding. But it is interesting. You find stuff in history and you just shake your head and you say, really? There it is. Cartoon drawings of drum sergeant majors administering lashes and teaching young soldiers how to do it appropriately so that they don't give deference to their friends. Yeah, boot camp wasn't like that for me. No lashes.
On the flip side of that, what is one part of the current pipe band uniform that you'd like to see evolve more?
Evolved more? Repeat that.
I think
You
he's
glitch.
actually.
Did I skip one?
Yeah, number 9.
Oh,
But I didn't hear you because you blipped anyway.
okay, that's fine. What is one part of the original Highland dress that you definitely don't want to see brought back?
Spats. I always hated spats. Always hated. They were originally called spatterdashes, and they were used to protect your shoes from getting mud in them and getting spatters up your legs and into your regular shoes. And they have buttons all the way up the side. Now, I cheated on mine and put Velcro, but they didn't have Velcro earlier. Not a lot of bands wear spats today because they're really a nuisance. So I'm glad we don't have spats.
Mm-hmm. I agree. So what is one part of the current pipe band uniform that you would like to see evolve more?
Evolved more.
Something that's like good, but not quite as good as it could be.
Although pipe bands originated as a military expression, most bands don't represent that style of dress anymore. It's really more civilian attire. But I'd like to see that kind of spiffied up a little bit. The jackets could be a little tidier, a little more tailored. Certainly having a vest in there dresses it up tremendously. I remember the day we used to wear bow ties instead of regular ties. There's something classy about that, something adding some class to it.
I wouldn't mind bow ties. I think that'd look nice.
Yeah, let's bring those back.
Or cravats. Is that what you called it? Cravat? Yeah.
There are dozens of ways that you can tie the cravat too, so that a cravat could be worn in a very manly way or a very feminine way, and it's still a cravat and it still passes muster. And it keeps your throat so that you don't get COVID. or any other.
I get
In fact, you could pull it up.
So on that note, everyone listening at home, we will conclude this week's episode, and we will see you back here next week when we'll talk a little bit more about fife and drum bands. And if you don't know what that is, well, you're going to learn. And if you do know what that is, you're still going to learn even more. We're going to have Michael back, and he's going to talk about all things fife and drum and how that may or may not relate to pipe band. So we will see you then. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening, everyone. If you enjoyed this show, then support us on Patreon for exclusive content as well as the video of us recording this. We'll have special exercises we'll be writing as well as tips and tricks with tenor drumming and other instruments to come. Subscribe to us on YouTube for some tenor tutorials and possibly other tutorials later on. And like us on Facebook at Podband Pipecast.